Hi, welcome to the G Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the Gross Out Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Faulkner. And I've been looking forward to today for a while because I get to talk to someone who's not just someone who I respect in the technical field that I know a lot, but someone who I've been friends with for a long time. We always joke around with people that we've known each other longer than OpenStack has existed. So I'm very lucky to have one of my long friends join the community at this point, probably close to a decade ago, maybe 8-10 years. But she's here in her role as the chair of the Open Infrastructure Foundation board, where she sat for 2 years or more. Julia, why don't you tell our guests a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi. So, I am the chair of the board of Infra Foundation, and it's sort of like I have two different jobs: a day job, which is my employer, Red Hat, and a evening afternoon job, which is chair of the board, and also help drive everything forward. So, largely, that's kind of what I do. And normally, if people want to talk to me, ask questions, they can find me on IRC as the Julia and OFTC IRC.
So how long have you been working in open source? Is OpenStack the first project you've worked on?
So OpenStack is not the first project. The very first project I contributed to was PPP. The thing you used with modems like 20 years ago?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was working for a custom engineering consultancy firm, and we needed a patch. And we're like, I've emailed the list, was like, is anyone working on this? And people were like, I'm interested, but I haven't done anything. And I guess it came back like a month later. Here's a patch on a web server. And I guess about 6 months later, I left that company. It's GPL license, so you had to make your change available. And I got this really angry email maybe 6 or 9 months later. It's like, your link is broken. How dare you remove the patch? And I was just like, okay, we'll get it fixed. I don't work there anymore. But it was just like, that was my first dip the toe into open source, really, beyond being just a consumer. And that was 2001, 2002, somewhere in there. Maybe even like 2000. Long time ago. And in the intermediate time, I did some work basically for a project called InBloom, which was a multi-state effort to build a visibility database into student education and learning rates in state and try and tie it all together. That as a project unfortunately failed. And then I ran into OpenStack, and I guess I interviewed to join HP in 2013 and finally got the offer in 2014. And I've been in OpenStack since.
Yeah, it was pretty neat because I still remember that Paris summit when it's like that was a pretty nice little moment to just encounter. My friend had joined up alongside, and I mean, even that was, you said 2014. I mean, that was a good 10 years ago. So in that 10 years, I come pretty far. I mean, you're chair of the Open Infrastructure Board. That's a pretty big deal. But I know that a lot of people who are listening, they may understand like some of the technical aspects of open source, but foundations, like what exactly is the role generally of a foundation in an open source project or like a collective of projects?
That's a great question. And I think it's a question you have to have some context around when you ask yourselves about it. So as for the context you really need, you have to think about where you are in a life cycle of a project and how many people you're working with and whether it's a single company or multi-company. And one of the great aspects that Foundation provides is a framework to work within where you're not the only party involved. And so that kind of levels the playing field, that enables that project to have like a longevity and a life without you. So your project can live on because you in that foundational model, you have structures where the foundation will continue to live, even if the worst should happen. And unfortunately, Jay may not really remember interacting with this person, but we actually had a contributor in Ironic who maintained several libraries who fell ill and unfortunately eventually did pass away. And that was very sad for all of us. And I think we're still dealing with trying to clean up the issues that were created by that, because they were doing stuff as a single person project. And that really does create some challenges, because it's not like you can go to a foundation and go, hey, you hold the rights, you enforce the trademark, you've got the lawyers in the background that can handle the various aspects should they be needed. And we just need to change this one thing. So now, because we have to now prove and make our case that, oh, this person is no longer around, they're never going to return, people still have to work through their processes. And there's really a trust barrier that you have to get across, especially when we start dealing with downstream consumers of projects. And so really you've really got to, if you're wanting to keep an open source project around for a long time and you're wanting to build consensus, you really need some fabric that binds the project together and then also enables the various governance aspects to operate and basically the various members to interact with it. And those are key critical aspects, but they're not things you think about when you're like, I've got a really cool problem to solve and I'm going to solve it this way. It's usually an afterthought that you're thinking about. Oh, I need to. What happens if a bus hits me tomorrow, or whatever? All things could happen, but you've just got to kind of deal with it and think about the worst case scenario and try and plan for it. And that's what foundations help enable: is that longevity, that governance, trademark management, all those things you don't want to think about as an engineer. They get handled.
So yeah, that's kind of leading into what I was saying, and I definitely remember that contributor is Ilya Tingoff. He's very much missed. We actually have someone over in G Research Open Source Software trying to basically rescue the ironic SNMP driver, because he pretty much Ilya pretty much heroically managed that and some of the libraries involved on his own, and we've had it bit rot since then. So we're trying to save that for the users who use it. It's a nice thing because there are definitely some users out there with older PDUs and stuff that gives them access to Ironic that they wouldn't have otherwise. But you were getting in when we're talking about the foundation aspect of it. Can we get maybe into a little bit of specifics as to why it's valuable, not just to have a larger community of individuals, but to specifically have that be some type of legal entity? Because the Open Infrastructure Foundation is, I'm sure it's some sort of combination of letters and numbers, corporation. So why is it important to have like your paperwork in order to go talk to lawyers instead of just, having a cabal of people?
So open source foundations generally are what are called industry associations, which are C6 nonprofits in the United States. The one major difference is the Apache Software Foundation, which is a C3 for the public good. And realistically, most open source foundations actually want to be for the public good. But the IRS has basically ruled that if you have corporate members that are helping sponsor the foundation, then you're really an industry association. So it kind of makes it a bit challenging there. But when we talk about having a foundation for the purposes of that guidance and structure, you build a tier structure where you have the people that you need to really do various tasks. So at like the board of directors level, we may get a challenge from the community, like we've got this, we want to see this thing, or we may have this pressing need that requires deep, thoughtful, big picture discussion. And that may take months to resolve. And we don't want to block projects from being able to move forward. Projects should be able to move independently and do what they need to do on a day-to-day basis, but we should provide guidance. One of the really recent aspects where it took us a long time to reach a consensus at a board level and try and find that happy path where it's like, let's see where the future leads us and try and drive things forward, was we actually developed a contribution policy for AI-generated content. And in our context, it's largely an ask for our contributors in our communities to say, yes, I used AI if I did. Appropriately label where it came from, any additional content that's required or needed to put it in scope, and also frame what type of AI, like generative, or if it's fancy autocomplete. And a really good example, actually, this is thanks to Jay, was he took some YAML and typed out what would be the name of the actual object, and an AI automatically suggested the entire next test that resulted in that content. And I use that as an example of, you kind of can just permit that. It's fancy autocomplete with some smarts behind it that could extrapolate some words to a couple of values. And it's like, it's not divining anything. It's taking the content we already had and adapting it. And so, it's fine. And that's kind of where we were able to split the difference, and then from there, revise the text, and then go to actually get lawyers on the call and go, what does this mean? How do you perceive it? Where's the industry going? And ultimately, we worked together to draft a policy that was applicable to our projects, that made the lawyers happy. And ultimately, hopefully, it puts the ecosystem in place where we want it to go, which is to enable experimentation and to not prevent ourselves from evolving.
I know that for me, like with usually I'm the detached host for this one, but I definitely have been involved and impacted by that decision. I've got a couple of folks on my team, and G Research is obviously heavily invested in machine learning, in artificial intelligence. That's where a lot of the servers we provision go to. And so that also means that folks who I work with on my team at Gross, folks like Adam and CID, they've had a huge amount of experience using some of these ML tools for various things. And so having Adam come to me and say, can I use this technology, and not having to rely on my own personal feelings or my own attempting to figure out what the landmine is, and being able to just point at that and say, that's the policy, we can follow that, and that does the right thing. And now, Adam is going and generating Tempest test based on our code to verify and make sure that our version handling is accurate in the API for changes happening. In fact, I think that may have been the first generated by patch landed in Ironic, was actually that fix to the Ironic tests. So I personally really appreciated that. And one of the things that I remember about that didn't necessarily come out here is that you actually solicited feedback directly from the community for that. I remember there were sessions, I think a couple of different sessions at our semi-annual gathering, where we talked about what that meant, what it was, where, there were people who brought up the issue that you brought up of the difference between like a fancy autocomplete and having a model write entire changes with human curation. And so I really appreciated that. And I think that's a good example of the value that a foundation can bring to the community. Because, I'm not a lawyer, some of us are doing the best we can to be engineers. So it's good to have folks to be able to help us out with some of those questions. So we've talked a little bit about how the foundation can provide like legal assistance, holding on to trademarks and copyrights and things that they can be held and live longer than maybe a single individual can. But are there other help, like maybe actual logistical assistance or infrastructural assistance that, at least specifically in the case of the Open Infrastructure Foundation, that y'all bring to your projects?
So it's really different with each foundation. And I will say the Open Infrastructure Foundation, or Open Infra Foundation, is there's this whole history of where we really wanted to be a C3. But because of some of the constraints, we actually can't do a lot of things like directly work on projects. We can help support infrastructure. We can help drive various aspects forward. We can help run user sessions and try and advocate for projects. But, we really, like, a hard line we have is we are not an intermediate contractor to bring development resources to projects. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that some of them I'm not even really aware of. It's just much more of a historical decision, plus the legal constraints that we have. So for the foundation, it's largely advocacy and marketing and try and get events to occur with the right people and get the right people to speak at other events. And sometimes that's like doing things like travel support to ensure that a contributor who's critical for this area is in a location where they can meet the other contributors and have the needful discussions. And really, community infrastructure is the really core critical aspect in supporting projects, because running an open source project, you can have a project in a Git repository. That's fine. You can have some CI pipelines defined and some testing. That's fine. But when you're trying to talk about integrating with a number of other projects in deep integrations, you start needing way more resources to do testing that doesn't necessarily execute in a few minutes, but takes hours. And that's where really the critical infrastructure that a foundation can help bring to the table through tooling, through people who are engaging, through donations of resources, to basically make that a layer that people can engage with and get what they need without having to really know the handshake to get the resources or have credentials to clouds or any sort of other challenge. Because, think about it, there's a whole bunch of logistics that are involved that as a contributor, day-to-day in OpenStack, we do not see. But they exist. Like resource management, CI testing, just log storage is challenging too, because of the scope of the jobs and the amount of logs they collect. And just, that's not a simple thing. So realistically, it's a bunch of different things that are lined up to help facilitate the software development process and keep an even playing field across companies and ensure there's consistency.
So you said something about community infrastructure, and I think that's sort of interesting because I know something I've seen sort of through my career working in open source and in corporate environments, that even just having a professional face that you can have someone talk to about a project can be a huge difference and really a perception breaker. And I personally seen employees of the foundation sort of taking on that role before, and being the professional face when maybe one of our more technical contributors is not always the best person to represent at the C-level or executive level at a company interested in OpenStack. Something that I've heard a little bit of movement on in this direction, and I sort of think is a good example of this, is maybe the issue with many VMware users migrating to OpenStack. Is there maybe specific things that y'all have done or are doing as part of that to maybe rescue some of those people who've been abused by the proprietary software industry?
That's an interesting way of putting it. But to answer the question, largely what we are doing as a foundation is we're trying to bring developers and users together to identify the needful pieces and the needful requirements. And so one of the aspects that came out earlier this year was a white paper specifically covering VMware migration to OpenStack. And it highlighted the various areas that need improvement because VMware is a very specifically designed product that has a lot of history behind it. Same was true with OpenStack. Both products were developed with different requirements in mind, different use cases. And so every use case you attempt to solve in, say, the VM world may not be applicable to OpenStack or any other hypervisor platform. So it was really necessary for the community to try and build that consistency context. And with that context, then additional discussions are able to take place and projects are able to either be focused on or revived, or, we're missing this one thing, or this is not that great for a VMware user, and it's just a user experience issue. We might be able to work on that. It really just depends on what the effort's going to be to solve that problem. And without identifying the difference or the change or the challenge that you have between the where you're at and where you want to go, it's difficult to even have that discussion. So ultimately, the foundation built a working group where people are able to talk about these items and really help raise awareness across organizations so that organizations interested can contribute, and organizations needing these things can go, I have this challenge, and have someone listen to them.
Yeah. One of the things that I sort of wonder about in that is, that's we're sort of talking about the relationship of like a foundation to maybe like potential users or contributors. But I'm curious about, if there's any foundation to foundation sort of relationships that happen. Like I always reach for the myth that there's sort of this combatants between like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, and the Open Infra Foundation, or OpenStack groups or things. And in reality, I know at least on a technical level we cooperate. Does that cooperation extend up through the stack to the foundations?
So there is a technical level cooperation, and there is between various foundations. There's common challenges, and there's usually hey, we're hearing this. Are you guys hearing the same thing? Or we're seeing this challenge. We should work together, sort of aspects. And those are separate discussions, and they do happen. And I think largely a lot of the I don't want to call it a myth because I know there is some contention in between communities. It's largely more people going, oh, that's old technology, or that's not the hottest thing now. No one's going to use it. No one's using it. And it's like you built this perception, or they built this perception, and that's not reality. And a lot of times where a lot of the bad blood occurs between open source projects is people get these perceptions and then are totally unwilling to reevaluate them, or even question, do I have a bad perception? And that's really the key thing that people just fail to do. And so you can have cross project collaboration. It does happen on a fairly regular basis. Unfortunately, every community is going to have people who are negative about various aspects, and it's just like, it's life. Really, the contributors that are building those successful relationships need to push back upon the contributors that are coming going, why do this? No one's going to use that, or whatever they're saying, because it's not helpful to the overall community. It's not helpful to everyone engaging.
I always like to say that kind of the default architecture for a lot of clouds has turned into a Kubernetes sandwich. Sometimes the Kubernetes is in the middle of the sandwich. It might be an open face sandwich with just some OpenStack and then little Kubernetes on top. Sometimes you've got a base level of maybe an OpenStack project like Ironic, building out Kubernetes and then having a VM cloud on top of that, or even using Kubernetes with something like Metal Cube to provision your OpenStack cluster and then your production Kubernetes cluster on top of that. It's you go into the wild and you talk to people who are running this, and you see that there are lots of different ways that people are combining these technologies. But the commonality is that it's very rare to see an OpenStack installation these days that doesn't at least have some form of Kubernetes attached to it.
Yes. And ultimately, there's a lot of challenges, and OpenStack even runs into the same challenge. I have services I need to orchestrate and run. And note, I say services, not platforms, not infrastructure tooling, services. And so where people really get hung up is or hung up's the wrong word. It's where people are using these tools is running the services in the way they need, in the configuration they need for their environments to suit their operational needs. And so you can have Kubernetes at the very bottom, Kubernetes at the very top, and you can have layers of OpenStack, and you can have users using VMs off to the side, or bare metal off to the side that are part of that same infrastructure, and it all coexists. And people can do things entirely separate and different. And that's not to say anyone's solution or architecture is the right way. It's just, what is the challenge they have before them, and how are they solving it? And that's really the power of open source, is that we provide the flexibility so that we can do that.
So is there something that you would maybe, when I hear about that and I sort of take that conversation, I combine it with the VMware pieces from earlier about how it's missing some pieces. Is there a couple of gaps, maybe not even just specifically in OpenStack or OpenInfra stuff, but maybe in the ecosystem entirely that need to be filled, or that are currently filling, that sort of thing? Like what's the next piece of glue we're going to need?
So I think we've got basically all the major pieces of glue for most users, except maybe like preemptible instances. But I think a lot of that is people coming with different workloads and different challenges and seeing the idea of preemptible instances and wanting to use that when they weren't using that in, say, a VMware environment necessarily. So what tends to happen when people start looking at these major migration projects is they start looking at how can I transform my business? How can I transform the way I'm doing things to a better way, not doing a complete parity focus. Some do just the one-to-one parity focus, and that's fine. But the tendency we start to see is people adding more requirements. And we've actually seen a resurgence in the bare metal space specifically because people are now looking for, oh, I really need a vendor-independent switch integration that is not network vendor A, B, C, D, E, or F. Or I need to be able to see the console on my bare metal servers. Those are aspects that people are coming saying, I need these features to be able to migrate. And do they really need them? Maybe not, but they're probably adding more requirements to meet their needs to ultimately make it a more enticing business decision for their users and for their business. And that's not a bad thing. It's a healthy engagement in open source and really building that consensus required.
Very wise Miss Poppins said once, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. And I'm sure that sort of cloud migration from going from one platform to another is the worst type of IT medicine you might have to take. So if you can get a few features out of the deal, that sounds like a good idea. So
yes, very much so.
One of the things we always like to talk about on this podcast is how, it's not necessarily a clean path from A to B when we're trying to get something done, that there's struggles along the way, there are bumps, and, that everyone we're talking to has overcome those as part of their journey. And so can you kind of gross out me and the audience with some type of story of one of these struggles or bumps that you've hit, maybe in context of the foundation or out, that has been conquered, and how you got through it for our listeners?
Oh, geez. I mean, we did briefly talk about the AI contribution policy, and this goes back to where foundations are different, and the core values of foundation drive the way foundation operates. So for me in that situation was much more, let's just build consensus. And I'm not really sure that that's like a really down and dirty story to have to share. It's just very much like, hey, let's be persistent and keep driving this discussion forward because we'll eventually reach the end. I feel like the most recent hardest challenge has actually been a CVE that I worked on, and just the painful nature of it's embargoed. Oh, okay, I only have these small group of people that I can engage with and discuss the issue, and then we have to work on it. Oh, we also have to prepare all our backports and get everything, all our I's dotted and T's crossed, and okay, this all of a sudden is a quick fix to months of work, and it's exhausting. And I don't even know where to go into telling that story because it is so arduous and painful. And Jay, unfortunately, you were one of those people on the inside of that embargo.
It's I describe it to people as when you're working on an embargoed bug like that, at least in our ecosystem, and I know other tooling might exist to make this a little bit less painful, but for us, I feel like I'm getting in the DeLorean. I'm going back 10, 20 years because, you don't have Garrett anymore. You're reviewing plain patch files. You're backporting stuff by hand. And then, in a job where, quite frankly, you work on open source software, you're looking at 3-month, 6-month, 12-month horizons. You don't have a lot of stuff that's immediate. It's a very much a shock to the system to have that immediacy. But I actually think this story fits very well in it because I think people have this idea of like the struggle being some sort of flashpoint moment, some sort of cool story. You're, slaying some giant dragon, but it's almost always something like this. It's almost always something mundane. It's almost always the stuff that you kind of have to muddle through that is difficult, that you've got to just know there's another side of it you're going to get out. And that sounds like it's true both for the CVE stuff and for the AI stuff of just having to put in the work that's necessary to get to the end. There's not a shortcut. There's not a magic trick. There's no sleight of hand happening where things appear harder than they are. It's really hard, and no amount of knowledge can get you away from that.
It is obscenely hard, and even if you have all the knowledge and context, it's that whole process of having to step through it one step at a time, very methodically, and go, is this the right course of action? And am I doing the right thing? And I know with the CVE, I stopped, started, and changed direction probably 3 or 4 times. And got some review feedback, and we missed half the stuff that we really need to focus on in that first review feedback, because, as you said, it's like you go back in time 20 years, you don't have a bunch of the tooling that you normally have. And kind of dealing with people to build that same consensus regarding AI, and finding the same words was difficult, same meanings behind words. What does this mean? How is this used? Those are all very hard things, and you only get really good at setting that same context by repeatedly having those same challenges in your career and learning, oh, yes, we have to make sure the same words are being used today. Even for me, I have times where it's like, oh, I need to get everyone on the same page now. And sometimes I recognize it in advance. Sometimes it's like halfway in a meeting, it's like, no one's on the same page. Oh no. Okay, we're shifting gears to get everyone on the same page. Then we'll have another meeting about this.
Well, it's interesting because I think that's sort of, you've sort of danced around the key, but we've not really said it out loud, that it is, getting help, having other people involved, that does come with work to get everyone on the same page. But if even if it had just been me and you working together to solve those CVEs, we would have missed stuff, right? Like we had to rely on other people in the community to help us find those issues. We relied on other people in the community to help us get them passing through CI. We actually have people in the community engaged to sort of grease the wheels of CI before it went out. And there's a lot of moving parts to an open source machine like this. And even if you are struggling in your little bit, there are other people there. They're there to help you, and they're willing to go for it. So this has been great. We're sort of close on time here, so I think I'm going to go ahead and thank you for coming and speaking with us, Julia. It's been really great. I've enjoyed it a lot. Do you want to point anyone to, a social media or maybe a website, or maybe tell our listeners if there's some way they can help out the foundation before we go?
If you're interested in joining the foundation, I believe we have a new website launching, openinfra.org. Previously openinfra.dev. I guess the next couple weeks.
That'll all almost certainly be live by the time this gets posted then. So
excellent.
Yeah.
Honestly, I can't really think much of social media right now because I've kind of dropped off a lot of social media given where the world's going. So
yeah, that's
my own mental health is important. And truthfully, just like the CVE, I had to prioritize my own health. And everyone should be mindful of that especially when working open source, because it can be so intense. And that's really my parting message, is focus on yourself, focus on what you need to do for yourself and not burn out. And that's, as someone who's burned out many times, that's a big challenge.
That's very good advice, especially I think the thing that contributes to that a lot with open source, especially in the longer term open source project, is that the bucket of work never empties. You're never going to get everything done. There is no done. There's just continually going. And at some point you just have to say, I know the bucket's going to constantly be refilling, but I have to go do this or some other thing instead.
Yeah.
That's a great thing to end on. I'd like to take a second and to thank Julia for being on our show. I always love chatting with Julia, on camera or not. I'd like to thank G Research Open Source Software for enabling me to have this podcast, to host this, for sponsoring all sorts of open source projects like OpenStack. We're a silver member of the Open Infra Foundation at G Research. And I'll point out, if you're currently looking for jobs, G Research is hiring almost constantly in London, UK, and in Dallas, Texas, with some limited hybrid opportunities there as well. So if you want to go to gresearch.com, and we'll have a link to the vacancies in the description below. I'll also make sure that we get links in the description to everything that was talked about today, including to OpenInfra website if you're interested in joining. But for now, this has been the Gross Out Podcast. On behalf of Julia, all of us here at Gross, I'm Jay Faulkner. Goodbye.